Morning, everybody. Good to see you all today. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here, for hanging out with us. Whether you're here physically, if you're with us online, it's just so good to be together. We are this week continuing a series we started last week called Enemies of the Soul. And this whole kind of series and everything goes back to really the first Christian monks and the beginning of Christian monasticism. So if you look at church history, for the first several centuries of the church's existence after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the church existed as a persecuted minority within the Roman Empire. It was actually illegal to be a Christian, and so Christians, they kind of suffered on and off again persecution. It wasn't like it was always there, but it was there sometimes. But they always existed as kind of like this marginal people in society, and they were kind of on the outskirts. That all changes, though, when you get to Constantine. Constantine is the emperor, and in the early 300s, he converts to Christianity, and that starts this process whereby over the next century or so, the empire will convert to Christianity. And so pretty quickly what happens is Christians go from a persecuted minority to a powerful majority within the empire. Now, most Christians in the empire celebrated this because, hey, guess what? We're not getting beat now, we're not getting killed now, we're not getting thrown in jail. This is a good thing. But there were some people that really saw some danger behind what was happening. Because as the empire became Christian, there was all of a sudden this mixing of Roman culture and Roman values with the Christianity and Christian values and Christian beliefs and what it really meant to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And so there was a certain group of people that saw kind of these two things coming together and thought, man, this isn't all good. There may be some good things happening, but there's some danger here. And what's happening is a corruption of Christianity and Christian faith, because the politics of the Roman Empire was all about, violence and conquering, and that's polar opposite to Jesus and what he was all about. So you had some people that as this Constantinian shift was going on, they actually fled major Roman cities and they went out into the desert, primarily in places like Egypt and Palestine and Arabia, and they became known as the desert mothers and fathers. And they were the first Christian monks, and they began the tradition of Christian monasticism. And really, they went out into the desert because they saw what was happening as destructive to what it meant to be a follower of Jesus and what it meant to be a community of faith. And they were going out there to seek God. And what was really fascinating is the language that they used to describe what was going on is they used the language of warfare, that it was a war. That this merging of imperial politics and Christian faith, it was a warfare where Roman imperial values were at war with what it meant to be a Christian. And the reason why that's so interesting is because the desert mothers and fathers were all pacifists. They wanted nothing to do with the war, but that's the language they used. Over time, as Christian monasticism developed, they came to define this war as being about three things. And here's what they are. It's a war about the devil, the flesh, and the world. These are the forces. These are the things that were attacking Christianity and Christian faith. And over time, these really become known within the Christian monastic tradition as the enemies of the soul. That's where we kind of got the title. We didn't come up with it. That these are the three things that when you had this merging of political power and of Christian faith, these were the enemies that were attacking and potentially destroying communities of faith and followers of Jesus. John Mark Comer, who's a pastor up in Oregon, he wrote this great book. It's a fairly new book, came out maybe a year ago, and it's called Live No Lies. And in it, he lays out this kind of formula of these three forces, and he says, here's how they work. Here's what it looks like in our life. And here's kind of the equation that he comes up with. He says it starts with deceptive ideas. And this is what we talked about last week. So if you were not here last week, you didn't watch last week, I really encourage you to go back and watch it because it kind of kicks off everything we're talking about. But deceptive ideas, which is what Comer calls the devil. We tend to think of the devil as, hey, he's this little guy with little horns and a pitchfork. But when the writers of the New Testament, when Jesus talk about the devil, it's actually a title, the Satan. It means the accuser. And so more than just being this really weird, funny guy, it's this whole idea of deception and of misinformation. And yes, it's this animating force that is behind so much evil. And so Comer says in his book, he says, what happens, it begins with deceptive ideas that play to our disordered desires, which is the flesh, that are then normalized in a sinful society. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about this idea of the flesh. and the disordered desires that deception and lies plays to. Now, I said this last week, but I want to say it again. If you are looking for a passage in the Bible, if you're looking for something that Jesus said, where Jesus said, like, the devil, the flesh, and the world, these are the three enemies of the soul, these are the things that are out to destroy us, you're not going to find that list, per se. But you will find Jesus and the writers of the New Testament talking about these three themes over and over and over again. For example, the Apostle Paul, he writes a letter to the church in Ephesus, and he says this. He says, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. So again, if you look at that whole passage, Paul actually mentions all three of those things. He says, listen, you used to live by the values of the world, which is the whole idea of the world. And then he talks about the ruler of the kingdom of the air. When the biblical writers, when they refer to the Satan, the adversary, the accuser, there's different titles that they'll use, and that's one of them. And then at the end here, he talks about gratifying the cravings of our flesh. So again, Paul mentions all three of them. He doesn't necessarily break it down in that category, but he mentions all three of those things. He mentions the devil, the flesh, and the world. Now again, today we're focusing on this idea of the flesh. And what does it mean? Like when the desert mothers and fathers, when they first started identifying this, and even when the New Testament writers, when Jesus talk about the flesh, what is it they're getting at? The New Testament's originally written in Greek. And in Greek, that word just means like physicality. Your physical self, my physical self. That is our flesh, what we would describe as us, as me. I am a physical flesh and blood being. Now, what's interesting about the idea of like physicality and flesh, at least within like the Western Christian tradition, is for a long time we have operated in a lot of ways with this dichotomy between like flesh and what we might call like spirit or spiritual. And a lot of us tend to think like, oh, well, this is in the Bible. The Bible talks about how there's a physical body, but we also have a soul, and one day when we die, our soul leaves our body and goes somewhere else. What's interesting, though, is that's actually not in Scripture. That's Plato came up with that. Plato the guy, not Plato the stuff that kids play with. Plato the guy. That was he's the one that broke that off and was like, no, we have a soul and there's soul. So he's the one that created that dichotomy. But again, in the Western world, when you have this mixture, like it just kind of gets incorporated into Christianity over time. We just kind of assume, oh, well, that's what happens. And so a lot of us have lived and operated with this mentality of, well, there's these two separate things. There's physical and there's spiritual. And we've tended to associate physical as bad and spiritual as good. Again, not all of us have operated that way, but for a long time within the Western world, that's kind of how we operated, this dichotomy. But you have to understand that that's not how Paul sees the world. That's not how Jesus sees the world. They don't see it as those two things being separate. Yes, they will talk about physical, they'll talk about spiritual, but for Jesus and Paul, those are the same thing. You are not either or, you're both. And those two things cannot be separated. You are both physical and spiritual, but those are not two separate realities. They make up you. And for Paul in this, physical is not by definition bad. Paul would not say that at all. Because again, if you go back to the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, everything that is physical, God creates it. God creates the physical world, and God creates you and I as physical people. And more specifically, we're told that when God creates us as physical people, he creates us in his image. As physical human beings, we are divine image bearers of God, meant to reflect his goodness and his character back into the world. And so physical is not bad. In fact, physical is good. It's good because God created it. So whenever you see the word like flesh or physical, that's not like Paul's way of saying, oh, it's all bad, it's all evil, it's all wrong. That's not what Paul's getting at. Physical is good because God made the physical. Not only that, but again, if you go back to that whole dichotomy of Plato, where it's, hey, we're a soul and one day we're going to escape and go somewhere else. And when we go somewhere else, the physical world is going to, just die and burn into a pile of rubble. That's not how Paul understands the Christian story. That's not how Paul understands eternity. If you look at the biblical story is a story of God renewing all of creation, that God is making it all new, including you and I. The biblical story doesn't end with us leaving this physical place and going somewhere else. It actually ends with God coming down to this physical place and renewing it and making it all new and making you and I new. So when you talk to Paul, when you talk to any of the New Testament writers, when you talk to Jesus, physical is not bad. It's good. The story of Scripture is a story of the renewal of physical creation. Paul even spends one chapter, a whole chapter, in a letter that he writes to the church in Corinth, talking about how when you and I get to the other side of eternity, when we get to what a lot of times we talk about as heaven, we get a renewed physical body. Paul spends a whole chapter, you can read it, like talking about what our physical body is going to be like. So physical does not equal bad. Physical is good. God created the physical world. God created physical people. He is renewing the physical world and physical people. But again, if you go back to how Paul understands the world, you and I are both physical and we're spiritual. And because we are both of those things are connected in a way that cannot be undone. When you separate those things, when there's the physical and there's the spiritual, when you talk about a concept like sin, which sin is this ugly judgmental word we don't like, but we tend to view sin as a spiritual issue. Sin is a part of the spiritual, and so sin affects us spiritually. And it gives us a guilty conscience, it makes us unrighteous before God or whatever language you want to use, like you can use. But we tend to think of sin as a spiritual thing with spiritual consequences. If I sin, I go to hell or whatever. But again, for Paul, we are both physical and spiritual. And so when we sin affects both our physical and our spiritual. That there are consequences in the physical world because of sin. Paul would actually say, you know why the world's messed up? Because of sin. Paul actually talks at one point about how all of physical creation is groaning because it's waiting for Jesus to make it right. That all of physical creation, what is wrong with physical creation, is a direct result of sin. That sin actually impacts the physical reality down to the physical bodies that you and I live in. That sin has actually corrupted our physical bodies. Augustine, who's one of the most famous Christian theologians, Augustine argued that one of the main impacts of sin on you and I is that it distorts our desires. The desire in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's not. We desire things. We want things. But what Augustine argues is he said, listen, sin has corrupted all of our internal physical desires. And the reason why this was important for Augustine is because Augustine understood something that I don't think a lot of us understand. See, we as modern people who live in the Western world, we like to believe that we live from a place of like reason and logic and like our rational mind. That's what drives us. Why do we make the decisions that we make? Why do we pursue the things that we do? Why do we live the way that we do? It's because it makes sense and it's rational and it's logical. That is a bunch of bull. That's not why we make the choices we make. That's not what drives us. What drives us is desire. The reason we make the choices we make, the reason we live the lives we live, is because it's our desire, because this is what we want. I want this, I want that, I want this. And so I'm going to orient my life, I'm going to live in a way, I'm going to choose things that get what I want. And so Augustine said, listen, this is why this is huge, because if sin has distorted our desires and we live from a place of desire, the problem with that is if we end up desiring the wrong things, or if we desire things in the wrong order, that's going to lead to destruction. That's going to lead to destruction in our own lives, in our relationships, in our world, in our society, all of that stuff. That's the danger of it. That's the problem with it. And see, Paul understood this. He got it. It all made sense. And this is why Paul, when he talks about himself, he talks about living within him are both of these realities. This corrupted physical self with its corrupted desires, but also this part of himself that is made in the image of God. You see, when Paul looked at himself, he's like, I'm not good or bad, but both of those realities live in me. I'm a divine image bearer of God, and that is good, but also within me is this, the word Paul would use as nature, this nature that has been corrupted by sin. and it has corrupted and distorted my desires. Here's what Paul writes about his own struggle in Romans 7, 21 through 23. Paul says, "So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil's right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me." And if you read this whole section of Romans, which we're just going to read this part, but Paul has kind of like this ping pong back and forth argument. And he's frustrated with himself because he'll actually say at one point, "I don't understand myself. All the things I want to do, I don't do. All the things I don't want to do, I do. Like I want to do good, but I end up doing bad," and it's this back and forth. And Paul says the reason for that is because within me is both of these things. Yes, I am a divine image bearer. My physical self is made in the image of Christ, but the problem is that physical self has been corrupted by sin, and it has disordered all of my desires. And so for a long time, what we defined as virtue was learning to say yes and no to the right desires. That's what we described as virtue. That's what Paul would have described as virtue, but even more so when you talk about like the Western world that we live in. The Western world really emerges with the Constantinian shift. That's what creates the Western world. But really from the time of Augustine on, because Augustine is one of the ones that defines this, this is how Augustine defines virtue. Virtue is learning to say yes and no to the right desires. But again, desire in itself is not a bad thing. Physicality is not a bad thing. So we have desires in us that are good. We have desires in us that have been corrupted. And we have to learn to say yes and no to the right desires and to put those desires in the right order. So for centuries, virtue is defined in terms of restraint. Learning to say yes and no to the right things. That all changes, though, with this guy, Sigmund Freud. Freud comes along, and Freud kind of challenges that driving paradigm. And what Freud said is he completely changes the game, because what Freud says, he says, listen, our problem as people, what creates all these neurosis inside of us is that we repress all of these desires. And in repressing these desires, this is what messes us up. And so Freud actually argued that really the most important, what creates virtue is pleasure. So you have all these desires, and the way to be a whole, healthy human being is to indulge these desires because they're from within you. And so after Freud, what happens is virtue gets changed from no, it's no longer about restraint. Now it's about indulgence. Now we're indulging all of these desires that come from within us because these desires are good. And indulging these desires is what makes us human. So stop trying to repress it, stop trying to contain it, and just indulge it and live with it and go with it. John Mark Comer in his book, he makes the observation that with Freud and everything he pushes, we actually as human beings, we make this move from prior to Freud, we were trying to be good, but now we're just trying to feel good. And the way that we feel good is we keep indulging all of these desires that come out of us. And the belief has been for a long time that if we just kind of indulge these desires, then we will be better people, we'll have a better culture, we'll have a healthier nation, a healthier world. And see, that dream actually isn't just Freud. That dream actually goes back to the Enlightenment. If you go back to the Enlightenment, the philosophical movement, out of the Enlightenment comes this idea that, man, as human beings, we have progressed to the point where we are just moving toward utopia. And if we keep moving forward, we're going to move toward utopia. And so as we advance technologically, as we make advances in society and socially and all that, we're going to create heaven on earth. This is how we're going to do it with progress. And so Freud and his kind of whole way of thinking, he's a big part of that. That you know how we keep making progress, you know how we keep moving forward, you know how we advance as human beings is we just learn to indulge in all of these desires because it's what's within us and it's natural and it's good. And so by indulging these, we experience pleasure, and that's going to continue to move us forward and move us closer and closer to this utopia. And that's that's the dominant worldview that has kind of driven much of our society. Now, I would argue, and I've said this before, that progressive myth has died a pretty brutal death over the last several years especially, but the last decade or two. That we no longer have this view that like, oh yes, everything is moving in the right direction. It's all going to be great. That the world is moving in the right direction, that our country is moving in the right direction. I don't know hardly anybody that thinks that. And not to be like too depressing, but if you ever talk to like younger generations, like junior high school students or something like that, even some high school students, if you ever ask them like, hey, when you think about the future, what do you think about? Younger generations ask questions that your and my generation, when we were their age, would have never asked. Like, are we going to be engaged in a gnarly civil war, just killing each other? Are we even going to be around as a country in that period of time? Like, these are the questions younger generations ask. We are no longer guided by this dream that, oh, everything's just getting better. It's all getting better. We're moving toward utopia. No, that whole like progressive myth died. But here's the thing. We still operate kind of on the basis that we still operate largely with this view of like, well, if we keep moving forward. And underneath that is Freud's view. That if we just keep, instead of trying to repress, let's just indulge. And when we indulge, this is how we become who we truly are. This is how we live out what's truly inside of us. This is how we become better. This is how we move forward. That thinking, that mentality still dominates our society. But let's just get real for a minute. And there's a question I want to ask, because this is a question, at least on a society-wide range, that I don't think we ask. But here's the question I want to ask. Because of the way we're living, are we thriving in ways that we were not previously? Now hear me out, because this is important. I'm not saying that there's not good things that haven't happened. I'm not saying that all the progress that has happened has been bad. I don't believe that. I believe there's some good things that happen. I believe there's still some good things that need to happen for us to make progress in certain areas in our society, in our culture, in our nation. But what I'm saying is, could we honestly sit here and say, you know what? As a people, as a community, as a nation, we are just thriving in ways that no civilization in human history has ever thrived. We are just at this place where, man, people are just flourishing in our culture and in our society in ways that people never have. And here's the thing. From where I'm sitting, I don't think we can say that. I mean, we have like epidemics of depression and mental health and drug and alcohol abuse and isolation and loneliness. Yes, we have some good advances in medicine and science and technology. We have some good social advances. We've come a long way in terms of some things, whether it's gender equality or race relations. Like, we've made some progress. We've got a long way to go in a lot of those things, but we have made some progress. But I don't think, in all honesty, we could sit here and go, we are just killing it in ways that no human civilization ever has. We're not. And again, when we look to the future, what do we see? We see despair. See, we've operated for so long on this kind of myth of progress and this, we just need to indulge in what's inside of us, indulge our desires. That's what'll lead to fullness. But what we found, what the evidence around us, I think, clearly shows, is that not only are we not thriving, we are dying. We are dying as a culture. We are dying as a civilization. We are dying as a nation. And the Apostle Paul, he would say, yes, but do you know why? Paul would say, I can tell you why. So you know what our problem is? Our problem is we look at what's happening in our culture, in our nation, in our world, and you know what we blame? Them? It's their fault. They did it. So we put up signs and flags in our yard, and it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. And then on this side, we're like, no. It's not our fault. It's their fault. So we put up things in our social media, and so we always have a them to blame. It's them. And when Paul comes along and Paul says, no. The reason we're dying as a culture and a civilization is not them. Paul says, I'll tell you what it is. Romans 8:13. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. Paul goes, look, it's not their fault. And it's not their fault. Paul says the problem is, the reason that we are dying is because we live in a world that is fueled, that the underwriting narrative of all of it is live by your desires, whatever those desires are. Because it's within you, it's natural, it's what leads to flourishing and thriving. Just do that. See, here's what Paul would say. Paul would say the problem, the reason we are dying as a culture, the reason we are dying as a nation is because there are deceptive ideas that have played to our disordered desires. That's why we're dying. And that's not their fault, and it's not their fault, it's our fault. It's true of all of us. It's true across the board. This is why we're dying. And I know you're going, I'm super glad I came to church today. This is another one's like pick me up things. I'm going to walk out of here feeling great. Can't wait to go to the beach, go to lunch. But it's sad. It's depressing, okay? But Paul does say, yeah, but you don't have to live that way. That's his point. Paul says, there's a whole other way to live. He says, yeah, if you live that way, you know what you're going to experience? Everything that we're experiencing right now. You're going to experience death. That's what happens when you live that. That's what happens when you and I believe deceptive ideas that play to our disordered desires. Because the desires in us, they're not all bad, but a lot of them are bad. So when we live from those disordered desires, yes, we're going to experience death. That's what's going to happen. Paul says, but you can also live by the Spirit. And if you do that, that's what leads to life. Now, I grew up in church my whole life. I've been in church my whole life. So my whole life, I've been taught about the Spirit. Spirit, by the way, whenever you hear that, Spirit just means presence. It's God's presence. So when Paul says you can live by the Spirit, what he's saying is you can live your life by God's presence. You can live your life in God's presence. You can live your life with God's presence. That's what he's getting at. And so I heard that my whole life. Like God's presence, God is with you, God lives inside of you. But the funny thing is, no one ever actually taught me what that meant. No one ever did. So there's this passage in, I think it's in Galatians, where Paul talks about, he says, walk in the Spirit. So I always kind of assumed like, well, I'll just walk and the Spirit will tell me what to do. So when I have an interaction with somebody, it's like, Spirit, tell me what to do. I'm walking in the Spirit. When I face this conflict in my life, Spirit, tell me what to do and I'll do it. And it never worked. Maybe it's worked for you, but it never worked for me. And so it's like this concept that the New Testament writers talk all over it. Live by the Spirit, live by the Spirit, live by the Spirit. And they'll even say things like this, live by the Spirit, not by the flesh. Because if you live by those disordered desires, you'll experience death, but the Spirit will lead to life. What does that mean? And see, one of the things I found out is that I've only ever been a part of Protestant churches. We are a Protestant church. And the thing about Protestant churches is Protestant churches came out of the Protestant Reformation, which began with a guy named Martin Luther. And what kickstarted the Protestant Reformation is that Martin Luther all of a sudden had this, like, it seems common sense maybe to us, but in Luther's day, it was this big thing that faith is all about what God has done for us in Jesus. See, for a long time, the church had held this like, no, it's about what you do, and you have to do these things to be saved, and you have to do this, you have to do this. And Luther comes along and based on his reading of the scriptures, Luther goes, no, it's not about us. It's about what God has done for us through Jesus, and we just respond to that. And so that was like this mind-blowing thing. That's what kickstarted the Reformation. And so that's still at the core of any churches that have Protestant roots, is that faith is ultimately about what God has done for us in Jesus. And that is true. It is. But Protestant churches have been so desiring to focus on that we've, in a lot of ways, neglected talking about what does it mean for us to really respond. That yes, it's all about what God has done for us in Jesus. And the reason we experience anything is because of what God has done for us in Jesus. That's the starting point of it. But we still have a role to play. And so Protestant churches, we have largely ignored topics like spiritual formation. Spiritual formation, even to some of us, if you're like me and you grew up you're thinking to yourself like, ooh, that's a new agey, weird, mystical thing. It's not. There's several different ways to define spiritual formation, but I like how Comer defines it in his book. He says it's this: the process by which we are being formed in our inner persons to become like Jesus. That's what spiritual formation is. It's the process by which within us we are being transformed to live more and more like Jesus. See, again, if you go back to the whole Platonic dichotomy of spirit and everything, the whole goal of faith was to escape the world. But again, if you understand historical Christianity and what Jesus was doing and saying and what Paul's doing and saying, you understand that Christian faith is about transformation. It's not about escaping a dying physical place. It's about transforming it. It's about renewal, the renewal of all things under Christ. And that includes you and I. And so spiritual formation is a part of the work that God is already doing in the world. The beginning with Jesus, God is working to renew and restore and transform creation from its corrupted state into what he created it to be. And that includes you and I. And so spiritual formation is about the process by which you and I and ourselves, our inner beings, are being transformed. See, at its heart, Christianity is transformational. It's transforming what's all around us and what's in us, and that's the work of God. God does that. Luther was 100% right. God is transforming things, but we do have a part to play. We're invited to join in on that transformation. And so spiritual formation is what that transformation looks like within each one of us. And the thing about spiritual formation is it's not like a mystery. It's not magical. It's actually pretty simple. It's not easy, but it's simple to understand. The way we experience spiritual formation in our own lives is through what we would call, we talk about them a lot around here as rhythms. They've also been called practices or disciplines. And what they are is they're things that we do in our daily life that actually create space for God's Spirit to work within us. So this is just a list. You don't have to write any of these down, but these are just some spiritual formation practices. Praying, confessing, giving, being in community, fasting, reading the Bible, repenting, serving, worship, simplicity. You can list out a ton more. But these are all things that we do in our life that create space for God's Spirit to work within us. And so this is what we miss, again, because, again, in Protestant churches, it's like, it's not about us, it's not about us, it's not about us, it's about God. Yes, spiritual formation is about what God is doing in your life through his Spirit that comes to live inside of us. But we have to do things that create space for the Spirit to move. And so that's what spiritual formation practices or disciplines or rhythms, that's what they're all about. Doing things in our life that create space for God's Spirit to transform us. Now, when we do these things, when we live by these rhythms, when we give God's Spirit room in our life to do something, the result is what Paul calls fruit. Like a healthy tree produces fruit, a healthy person produces fruit. And Paul actually describes beautifully in Galatians, he says, here's what spiritual formation looks like. Here's what the fruit looks like. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I don't know anyone that wouldn't want to look more like this. And Paul says, see, this is what spiritual formation looks like because this is what Jesus looked like. And so when you and I live in such a way that we create space for God's Spirit, we experience transformation and we come out looking more and more like this, which this is what our world needs. This is what's going to bring life to the dying world and culture and nation in which you and I live. Now, some of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we've never engaged in any kind of spiritual rhythms or practices because we're too busy or whatever our excuse is. And so some of us, it's like, okay, you know what? I just need to find time. I need to do it. But I know there's others of us that we're sitting here going, yeah, but you know what? I've tried that. I tried to pray. I tried to read the Bible. I tried to give or be in community or whatever, and it didn't work. It didn't do anything. And I understand that because I've experienced that in my own life. And now I want to read something that Peter wrote real quick. Peter was like one of Jesus' closest friends. And in one of his letters that we have in the New Testament, Peter brings up something that this really, in this whole conversation we're having right now, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where it gets really difficult. Because Peter's going to explain, here's why we don't experience transformation. And here's why most of us live by the flesh as opposed to the Spirit. And here's what Peter writes. Here's what he says. He says, those who follow the corrupt desire of the flesh and despise authority. See, the whole idea, when you talk about formation, spiritual formation, but just look at the word formation. Formation is about taking something and forming it into something that it's not. And so that takes a little pressure, that takes a little work, that takes a little correction, that takes molding. That's not fun. That's not comfortable. If you want to form something into something that it's not, that is going to be very uncomfortable. And that is going to require submission, and that is going to require humility. And Peter says, this is why we don't experience spiritual formation. Because here's the thing, you can read the Bible every month all the way through. You can pray 20 hours a day. You can serve, you can give, you can worship all week long. But if that doesn't begin first with submission, nothing will happen in your life. Because it's not just about what you do, it's about the posture with which you do it. And so if I'm not reading the New Testament with a posture of submission, I'm not letting God mold me, and I'll never experience transformation. None. Let's see what Peter's picking up on here is the oldest story in the Bible goes back to the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden. God creates people, he puts people in the middle of the garden. And what do people do? They rebel against him. And when you read the way that the writer of Genesis words that, their rebellion is really rooted in, we want to be like God. We want to decide what is good and what is evil. We want to make those ultimate choices. So they reject God and place themselves there because they didn't want authority. They didn't want someone else to tell them what to do. They wanted to be their own boss. They wanted to call the shots. And see, again, the culture that you and I live in, we have clearly enshrined the self as the only God. And we resist authority. This is why we don't experience transformation. My kids, I love my kids and my kids are great, but like most kids, they don't always listen to me. They don't always respect me. They don't always do what I say. And so there have been moments in the midst of kind of these back and forth things where I've actually looked at my kids and I've said to them, I'm like, hey, do you want me to be your dad? Now, hold on, just let me make this very clear. I'm not saying that was a good thing. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm not saying, hey, this is great parenting. You should look at your kids. I'm not like, there's some of you out there that are like therapists or psychologists that are going, Scott, you just jacked up your kids and they're going to be in my office in 10 or 15 years. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying I did it, okay? So cut me some slack. You can judge or criticize. I'm just saying I did it. I was like, because then when I would go on to tell them, I was like, look, me being your parent, I mean, my God-given responsibility, your mom's my God-given responsibility, isn't just to give you everything you want, it's to help mold you into who God created you to be. And as you grow, there's things you need to learn, and sometimes that's going to be uncomfortable, and sometimes you're not going to like it. Sometimes there's going to be correction or discipline or difficult conversations or whatever. But that's how this parent-child thing works. And in order for it to work effectively, you're going to have a bit more humility. I need to do some things different. I'm not saying I'm great, but I'm like, you're going to have some humility, and you're going to have to submit to me, and you're going to have to let me do that. Because that's how formation works. If you fight me all along the way, my kids could live in my house up until they're 18, and then they could leave. But if they fight me on the whole way, then there will be no formation that happens at the end of that. They were there, but nothing happened. See, formation only works if we submit. Spiritual formation requires us to begin by acknowledging that, you know what, God? I'm not who I should be. I want you to form me into something new, and so I surrender and I submit to that. And all the uncomfortableness that's going to come with that. My kids, both of them right now, they're in different phases, but they're in the process of braces. Which every time I take my kids in to go get braces, I have like PTSD of when I had braces. Because when I was a kid, I had some like jacked up jaw issues. So my jaw was like too small. I had to remove 4 baby teeth. They had to drill in, pull out 4 adult teeth. I had to have braces. I had to wear headgear, I don't even know if they still do that, but you had to like strap it around your neck, and it looked like this big old gnarly thing. And it was awful. It was terrible. Because the thing about braces is pretty much if it's a good food, there's like a 75% chance you can't eat it if you have braces on. You can't chew gum, you can't eat popcorn, you can't like gummy bears, you can't have soda. And I'll just be honest, I was a terrible orthodontics patient. I always had loose braces that were having to get tied and put back on. But it was not fun. Because getting your teeth cleaned wasn't fun, but you get your teeth cleaned, you leave, and everything's fine. Every time you go into the orthodontist, they readjust those things and you tweak them, so when you leave, it's tight and it's pulling and it's uncomfortable. So every time we take our kids in, they come home and it's like, oh, it's uncomfortable. I'm like, I know, I've been there, it sucks. And it's a few days of that, and then you finally get used to it, and then you go back and you get readjusted. It is like this painful, annoying, uncomfortable process. And sometimes, if you hit your jaw when you got braces, it like tears up the inside of your mouth. It's a miserable experience. just is. Now here's the thing. Here's what I'll tell you right now. As a 43-year-old person, I'm glad I did it when I was 13. I am. Because at 43, I would not want to have the jaw I had when I was 13. I wouldn't. I'm glad I did it. If you could go back and ask my 13-year-old self, is this worth it? Do you want to do this? Heck no. I don't care. Let me live with crappy teeth my whole life. It doesn't matter to me. But on the other side of all the pain and all the uncomfort and all that, I'm grateful I did it. That's how transformation works. That's how spiritual formation works. I know sometimes I've heard like preachers and ministers be like, listen, you always have to make faith seem like it's like this super fun, super easy thing. And like I get that you want to make it attractional, but I also don't want to lie to you. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything about spiritual formation is totally easy and simple, and this is not true. Yes, there are breakthrough moments. There are moments of celebration. There are moments of joy. There are moments of incredible freedom. But there's also difficulty because spiritual formation, again, is about God taking you through the power of his Spirit that you've created space for in your life and forming you into someone new. And that requires pressure. And that requires some uncomfortability and it's difficult. But here's the other thing I can promise you. That is the path of life. That's the path that leads to human flourishing and thriving. That's what Jesus said. I came so you could have life and have it to the full. Look, all around us, this is what happens when we live by the flesh. This is what happens when we believe deceptive lies that cater to our disordered desires and when we live from indulging in those desires. This is what happens. And it's death and destruction and despair. But there is another way to live that's rooted in life and renewal and restoration. And that path begins with surrender. In the New Testament, when people would first surrender their life to Jesus, they would get baptized. Baptized is a word that means to dunk or to immerse. And the whole idea behind baptism is you place one thing into something else. And baptism was about us placing our life, surrendering our life to Jesus. That's where renewal and transformation begins. That's where life in the Spirit begins. And if you've never taken that step, next week, every September, we do this thing called beachtism. We go down to the beach and we celebrate baptisms down there and hang out and sing a little bit and eat. It's a blast. It's going to be next week. If you've never taken that step, maybe it's time for you to take it. Maybe it's time. Because that's the step at which renewal and transformation begins to happen. And so I want to challenge you this week to think about it. Talk about it. Pray about it. If you're tired of living the way you've always been living and you want to try something new, you want to live a life that leads toward fullness, it starts with that surrender. And surrender for us starts with baptism. It's a simple little ceremony, but it's profound in what it means and what it does in our life. Let me pray. God, I thank you. I thank you for your love for us. I thank you that you came down to this earth and you died and you rose again. And through the power of that resurrection, you are renewing all of creation. God, that's the good news. That's the gospel. That's the hope that we have, that even in the midst of all the despair we're living in, God, that we can live with hope because we know that behind all of this, you are working to renew this world and you are working to renew us. God, my hope as people is that, Father, we would recognize the areas in our lives that we hold on to, the areas in our lives that we have not surrendered. Because, God, the truth is all of us, whether we've been baptized at this point or not, all of us struggle with issues of surrender and submission to you in our life. God, that we would begin to see where those are and we would let them go. And we would live lives of surrender and submission to you because that's what leads to transformation, which leads to renewal, which leads to thriving and fullness in life. And Father, that's what we want for each other, for ourselves, for this community, for this nation, and for this world, is to live the way you created us to. God, we love you and thank you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.